Lance Corporal James Mitchell stood at attention in the pre-dawn darkness of September 19, 2022, his scarlet tunic pristine and his bearskin cap perfectly positioned. At just 24 years old, he had been selected for one of the highest honors in the British military, serving as part of the Queen's Company during Her Majesty's state funeral. The weight of his responsibility felt heavier than the ceremonial rifle he carried. James had joined the Grenadier Guards 5 years earlier, following in the footsteps of his grandfather who had served during World War II. Growing up in a small village in Yorkshire, he had always been fascinated by stories of duty, honor, and service. His grandfather, William Mitchell, had often told him about standing guard at Buckingham Palace in the 1940s and how the young Princess Elizabeth would sometimes smile and wave at the guards during her visits. The training for this day had been intense and exhaustive. For months, James and his fellow guardsmen had practiced every movement, every step, every gesture that would be required during the funeral procession. They had rehearsed in the early hours of the morning, when London streets were empty and quiet, learning to march in perfect synchronization while maintaining the stoic expressions that were expected of the Queen's Guard. Westminster Abbey buzzed with quiet activity as the final preparations were made. James could see the controlled chaos of organizers, security personnel, and media crews all working to ensure that every detail was perfect. This wasn't just any funeral. It was the farewell to a monarch who had reigned for 70 years, who had been a constant presence in the lives of billions of people around the world. As James took his assigned position along the nave of the Abbey, he thought about the significance of the moment. Queen Elizabeth II had been on the throne for his entire lifetime, and that of his parents. She had been a symbol of stability, duty, and grace through decades of change and challenge. Now, as world leaders, members of the royal family, and hundreds of distinguished guests filed into the historic church, James felt the profound responsibility of ensuring that her final journey would be conducted with the dignity and respect she deserved. The morning air was crisp and clear as crowds began to gather along the funeral route hours before the ceremony was scheduled to begin. James could hear the distant murmur of voices, the shuffling of feet, and the occasional sob of someone already overcome with emotion. Television crews from around the world had positioned their cameras to capture every moment of the historic day. Colonel Richard Hampton, the commanding officer overseeing the Queen's Company, had briefed the guards one final time before they took their positions. His voice had been steady and authoritative as he reminded them of their duties and the importance of maintaining their composure throughout the ceremony. "Gentlemen," he had said, "today the eyes of the world are upon us. We represent not just ourselves, not just our regiment, but the very essence of what it means to serve the crown." Queen Elizabeth II dedicated her life to duty and service. Today, we honor that legacy through our own conduct. James had nodded along with his fellow guards, understanding the gravity of the colonel's words. But as he stood in the Abbey, watching the early arrivals take their seats, he couldn't shake a feeling that something unexpected might happen during the ceremony. He had learned during his years of service that even the most carefully planned events could take surprising turns. The Queen's Company had been formed in 1656 and had served as the personal guard to British monarchs for over 3 centuries. James felt the weight of that history as he stood among the ancient stone columns of Westminster Abbey. Generations of guardsmen had served with distinction, and now it was his turn to uphold that tradition. As the morning progressed, James noticed the increasing number of people arriving for the ceremony. There were heads of state, members of parliament, representatives from the Commonwealth nations, and countless others who had come to pay their final respects to the Queen. Each arrival was carefully orchestrated, with protocol officers ensuring that everyone was seated according to precise arrangements that had been planned for years. The media coverage of the funeral was unlike anything James had ever witnessed. Cameras were positioned throughout the Abbey and along the entire funeral route. He had been told that an estimated 4 billion people would be watching the ceremony, making it one of the most viewed events in television history. The thought was both humbling and slightly overwhelming. James remembered the day when the Queen's death had been announced. He had been on duty at Windsor Castle when the news broke. The immediate reaction had been one of shock, even though everyone knew that at 96 years old, the Queen's health had been declining. There had been a moment of stunned silence among the guards, followed by an outpouring of emotion that was both personal and professional. They had lost not just their sovereign, but someone who had been a constant presence in their lives and careers. The preparation for the funeral had begun immediately. Every aspect of the ceremony had been planned and rehearsed countless times over the years as part of Operation London Bridge, the code name for the arrangements following the Queen's death. James and his fellow guards had participated in numerous rehearsals, practicing their movements until they could perform them flawlessly even under the intense pressure and emotion of the actual event. The Queen's coffin, draped in the royal standard and topped with the imperial state crown, had been lying in state at Westminster Hall for 4 days before the funeral. James had been part of the ceremonial guard during some of those vigils, standing motionless for hours while hundreds of thousands of people filed past to pay their respects. He had witnessed incredible displays of emotion and devotion, with people waiting in line for up to 24 hours for the chance to say goodbye to their queen. During one of those vigil shifts, James had noticed an elderly woman who had approached the coffin with the help of a walking frame. She had stood there for several minutes, tears streaming down her face, before placing a small poppy flower on the barrier surrounding the catafalque. Later, he learned from a colleague that the woman was a 90-year-old veteran who had served in the Women's Royal Naval Service during World War II. She had wanted to pay her respects to the Queen who had inspired her service to her country. These moments had reinforced for James why his role was so important. He wasn't just following protocol or performing ceremonial duties. He was helping to facilitate a collective moment of mourning and remembrance that was bringing people together from all walks of life and from around the world. As the ceremony time approached, James could feel the energy in Westminster Abbey shifting. The quiet bustle of preparation was giving way to a more solemn and focused atmosphere. The Archbishop of Canterbury arrived and began his final preparations for leading the service. The choir took their positions and began their pre-ceremony preparations, their voices echoing softly through the ancient stone halls. James had always found Westminster Abbey to be a place of profound spiritual significance. The Abbey had been the site of coronations, weddings, and funerals for British royalty for nearly 1,000 years. Standing within its walls, he felt connected to centuries of history and tradition. This was where Queen Elizabeth II had been crowned in 1953, where she had married Prince Philip in 1947, and now where she would be laid to rest with the dignity and ceremony befitting her remarkable life and reign. The international dignitaries began arriving in greater numbers as the start time drew near. James watched as President Biden, President Macron, and dozens of other world leaders took their seats. The sight was remarkable. Leaders who often disagreed on matters of policy and diplomacy united in their respect for the Queen and their desire to honor her memory. As James maintained his position, he reflected on what the Queen had meant to the country and to the Commonwealth. She had been on the throne during some of the most significant events of the 20th and 21st centuries. She had witnessed the end of the British Empire and the transformation of the Commonwealth, the Cold War, the Digital Revolution, and countless other changes that had reshaped the world. Throughout it all, she had remained a constant figure, providing stability and continuity in times of uncertainty and change. Her commitment to duty and service had been unwavering, and she had earned the respect and admiration of people across the political spectrum and around the world. The Queen's dedication to her role had been legendary. She had undertaken thousands of official engagements, met with countless world leaders, and had been patron to hundreds of organizations and charities. Even in her final years, she had continued to carry out her duties with grace and determination. James thought about his own commitment to service and how the Queen's example had influenced his decision to join the military. Her sense of duty and dedication had been an inspiration to countless people who had chosen careers in public service. The values she embodied, duty, honor, service, and sacrifice, were the same values that guided James in his own military career. As the final preparations were completed and the ceremony was about to begin, James felt a profound sense of privilege and responsibility. He was about to participate in a historic moment that would be remembered for generations to come. The eyes of the world were indeed upon them, and he was determined to honor the Queen's memory through his own conduct and dedication to duty. The funeral procession began with the haunting sound of the last post echoing through Westminster Abbey. James felt the weight of history as the Queen's coffin was carried into the Abbey by 8 pallbearers from the Queen's Company, 1st Battalion Grenadier Guards. The silence that followed was profound and moving, broken only by the soft rustle of fabric as 2,000 mourners rose to their feet in unison. As the service began, James maintained his position with military precision, but his eyes occasionally swept across the congregation. He could see members of the royal family in the front rows, their faces etched with grief, but maintaining the composure that had been expected of them throughout their lives. King Charles III sat with his shoulders squared, his expression solemn but controlled. Prince William and Prince Harry sat nearby, their own emotions carefully contained as they said goodbye to the grandmother who had been such a central figure in their lives. The Archbishop of Canterbury's voice filled the abbey as he began the funeral service with words that had been carefully chosen to reflect both the magnitude of the moment and the personal loss felt by so many. "We gather today in remembrance before God of a faithful life of service," he said, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the ancient building. Elizabeth II, by the grace of God, Queen of this realm and of her other realms and territories, head of the Commonwealth, defender of the faith. James had participated in many formal ceremonies during his military career, but none had felt as significant as this moment. The weight of tradition, the presence of world leaders, and the knowledge that billions of people around the globe were watching created an atmosphere unlike anything he had ever experienced. Every movement, every gesture, every moment of silence carried profound meaning. The hymns and readings that followed were deeply moving. When the congregation sang, "The Lord's my shepherd," James could hear voices wavering with emotion. The ancient words took on new meaning in the context of saying farewell to a monarch who had shepherded her people through 7 decades of change and challenge. During the service, James noticed something that would stay with him for the rest of his life. In one of the reserved sections, he spotted an elderly man in a wheelchair who appeared to be struggling to see the proceedings due to his seated position behind taller mourners. The man was wearing military decorations that suggested he was a veteran, and James could see the disappointment and frustration on his face as he craned his neck, trying to get a better view of the ceremony. The man appeared to be in his 80s or 90s, with silver hair and weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work and service. His military medals included what James recognized as campaign medals from conflicts spanning several decades. This was clearly someone who had dedicated his life to serving his country, just as the Queen had done, and yet he was missing this historic moment due to something as simple as his seating position. James felt a tug of recognition and empathy. His own grandfather had been a veteran, and he knew how much this ceremony would have meant to him. Veterans of the Queen's generation had served during World War II, had lived through the transformation of the British Empire into the Commonwealth, and had witnessed the Queen's entire reign. For them, this wasn't just the funeral of a monarch. It was the end of an era and the farewell to someone who had been a constant presence throughout their adult lives. The strict protocol of the ceremony dictated that guards should remain in their assigned positions without deviation. Moving from his post without authorization would be a serious breach of military discipline, especially during such a high-profile event. But as James watched the elderly veteran's continued struggle to see the proceedings, he felt an internal conflict between following orders and doing what seemed right. The ceremony continued with readings from Scripture and tributes that painted a picture of a life devoted to duty and service. The Queen's commitment to her role had been absolute, and the speakers emphasized how she had put the needs of her people and her Commonwealth before her own personal desires throughout her 70-year reign. As the service progressed, James found his attention repeatedly drawn back to the elderly veteran. The man had given up trying to crane his neck, and had settled back in his wheelchair with a look of resigned disappointment. James could see that he was wiping his eyes, whether from emotion at the ceremony he could hear but not see, or from frustration at a situation James couldn't tell. The moment that would change everything came during the reading from Ecclesiastes. For everything there is a season, and a time for every matter under heaven. As those words echoed through the abbey, James made a decision that would go against his training, but would align with something deeper, his sense of compassion and respect for a fellow person who had served his country. Moving with the same quiet precision that characterized all his military movements, James stepped slightly to his side and gestured subtly to the elderly veteran. The man looked up in surprise as James quietly indicated that he should move to a position where he would have a clear view of the ceremony. The veteran's eyes widened with understanding and gratitude, and he maneuvered his wheelchair to the spot James had indicated. The entire exchange took less than 30 seconds and was conducted with such discretion that most of the surrounding mourners didn't even notice what had happened. But for the elderly veteran, the impact was immediate and profound. Suddenly, he could see the Queen's coffin, the royal family, and the magnificent ceremony that was unfolding before them all. James returned to his position, maintaining his military bearing and composure, but he felt a sense of satisfaction that transcended any concern about potentially breaking protocol. He had witnessed the immediate change in the veteran's demeanor. The man's face had lit up with joy and gratitude, and he was now able to fully participate in this historic moment. The subtle gesture had not gone completely unnoticed. However, several mourners in the nearby area had seen what James had done, and the looks they gave him conveyed appreciation and approval for his act of kindness. One elderly woman nodded at him with a smile that seemed to say, "Well done, young man." More importantly, a photographer from one of the major news organizations had captured the moment. The image would later become one of the most shared and celebrated photographs from the entire funeral ceremony, not because it showed the pomp and pageantry of the event, but because it captured a moment of human compassion in the midst of formal protocol. As the ceremony continued, James noticed other small moments of humanity that were occurring throughout the abbey. People were comforting each other, sharing tissues, and offering quiet words of support. The formal nature of the event hadn't eliminated the very human emotions and connections that were being experienced by everyone present. The veteran whom James had helped was now fully engaged in the ceremony. James could see him mouthing the words to the hymns and bowing his head during the prayers. When the 2-minute silence was observed, the man sat perfectly still with his head bowed, clearly using the time to reflect on his own memories of the Queen and what her reign had meant to him personally. During that silence, James reflected on what he had just done. He had made a choice to prioritize compassion over rigid adherence to protocol. It was a decision that his grandfather would have understood and approved of. Military discipline and respect for authority were important, but they should never come at the expense of basic human kindness and consideration for others. The service continued with the commendation, as the Archbishop spoke the words that formally committed the Queen's soul to God's care. "Go forth upon thy journey from this world, O Christian soul," he said, his voice carrying the weight of finality and hope. The words were both a goodbye and a blessing, acknowledging the end of the Queen's earthly reign while expressing faith in her eternal rest. As the ceremony moved toward its conclusion, James felt a deep sense of privilege at having been part of this historic moment. But more than that, he felt proud of the choice he had made to help a fellow veteran experience this ceremony with dignity. It was a small act, but one that embodied the values of service and compassion that the Queen herself had demonstrated throughout her life. The final hymn, "God Save the King," marked the transition from one reign to another. As the voices of the congregation filled the abbey, James stood at attention, knowing that he had not only fulfilled his duty as a guard, but had also honored the spirit of service and compassion that had defined the Queen's remarkable life. The moment would soon become much more than just a personal satisfaction for James. The photograph of his gesture was already being shared around the world, touching hearts and inspiring others with its simple message that kindness and humanity should never be sacrificed to rigid formality. In helping one elderly veteran see the Queen's funeral, James had reminded millions of people what truly matters in life. As the funeral service concluded and the procession began to move toward the doors of Westminster Abbey, James maintained his position with unwavering discipline. The Queen's coffin was lifted once again by the pallbearers, and the slow, measured steps began that would carry Her Majesty on her final journey through the streets of London to Windsor Castle for her burial. The elderly veteran whom James had helped was now able to watch every moment of the procession as it passed by his improved vantage point. James caught a glimpse of the man's face and was deeply moved by the expression of profound gratitude and peace he saw there. The veteran placed his hand over his heart as the coffin passed, a gesture of respect that spoke volumes about what this moment meant to him. As the immediate ceremonial duties concluded and the abbey began to empty, James felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Colonel Hampton approaching, and for a moment, James wondered if he was about to be reprimanded for his deviation from protocol. The colonel's expression was unreadable as he motioned for James to step aside from the other guards. "Lance Corporal Mitchell," the colonel said quietly, his voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the departing crowd. James braced himself for what he assumed would be a disciplinary conversation. "Sir," he responded, standing at attention and looking straight ahead. To James's surprise, Colonel Hampton's stern expression softened slightly. "I observed what you did for that veteran during the service," he said. "It was noticed by quite a few people, actually." James felt his heart rate increase, unsure whether this observation was leading to praise or punishment. "Sir, I apologize if I acted inappropriately," James began, but the colonel held up a hand to stop him. "On the contrary, Lance Corporal, what you did embodied the very best of what it means to serve. Yes, you technically stepped outside of strict protocol, but you did so for the right reasons and in a way that enhanced rather than detracted from the dignity of the ceremony." The colonel paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. The Queen herself spent her entire life showing consideration for others, especially for veterans and those who had served their country. Your action today honored her memory in a way that mere protocol never could. James felt a wave of relief and pride wash over him. The colonel continued, "I've been in the service for 32 years, and I've seen plenty of soldiers who could follow orders to the letter, but who lacked the judgment to know when compassion should take precedence over rigid rule following. Today, you showed both military discipline and human decency. That combination is what makes a truly exceptional soldier." As they spoke, James noticed that several people were approaching them. The elderly veteran was being wheeled over by a younger man who appeared to be his grandson. The veteran's eyes were bright with emotion as he drew near. "Excuse me," the younger man said, addressing both James and Colonel Hampton. "My grandfather, Albert Thompson, wanted to thank the young guard who helped him see the ceremony properly. He's a veteran of the Korean War and the Falklands, and attending this funeral was incredibly important to him." Albert Thompson reached out with a trembling hand toward James. "Son," he said, his voice wavering with emotion, "what you did for me today meant more than you could possibly know. I served for 38 years, and I wanted to pay my proper respects to our Queen. Because of your kindness, I was able to do that." James took the veteran's hand gently. "Sir, it was my honor. Thank you for your service to our country." The simple exchange was profound in its sincerity and mutual respect. Albert's grandson pulled out his phone and showed James and the colonel a social media post that was already gaining traction online. It was the photograph of James helping Albert move to a better position, captured by the news photographer during the ceremony. The image had been shared thousands of times in just the few hours since the funeral had ended. "Look at some of these comments," the grandson said, scrolling through the responses. "People from all over the world are talking about this moment. They're saying it shows the true spirit of what the Queen represented, putting others before yourself and showing kindness even in the most formal situations." James was amazed to see how quickly the image had spread and how powerfully it had resonated with people. Comments were coming in from every continent, with people sharing their own stories of acts of kindness they had witnessed or experienced. Veterans from different countries were particularly moved, with many saying that the photograph reminded them of why they had chosen to serve. One comment that particularly struck James read, "This is what leadership looks like. Not the person at the front of the parade, but the person who notices when someone is struggling and quietly does something to help." This young Gar understood what really matters. Another comment from a veteran in Australia read, "I'm 87 years old and I served in Vietnam. Watching this young soldier help his elder reminded me that the values we fought for, compassion, respect, service to others, are still alive in the next generation. God bless them both." Colonel Hampton looked at the growing response to the photograph with apparent satisfaction. Lance Corporal Mitchell, "It appears that your moment of compassion has touched people far beyond Westminster Abbey. This is becoming a symbol of the kind of values that the Queen herself embodied throughout her reign." As they continued to review the social media responses, James noticed that news organizations were beginning to pick up the story. The BBC had posted the photograph with a caption that read, "A moment of compassion during the Queen's funeral as a Grenadier Guard helps a veteran get a better view of the ceremony." Sky News had shared it with a headline, "The Spirit of Service. Guard's kind gesture goes viral." What was particularly moving to James was that the responses weren't just from the United Kingdom. People from around the Commonwealth and beyond were sharing the image and expressing how it had touched them. A teacher in Canada wrote, "I'm showing this to my students as an example of how small acts of kindness can have a big impact." A veteran's family in New Zealand commented, "This reminds us of our grandfather who served in World War II. He would have been so moved by this gesture." The photograph was also being shared by official military accounts and veteran organizations worldwide. The Royal British Legion posted it with the message, "This beautiful moment exemplifies the respect and camaraderie that exists between generations of those who serve." Similar organizations in other Commonwealth countries were sharing it with their own messages of appreciation. As the afternoon progressed and more media outlets picked up the story, James found himself somewhat overwhelmed by the attention his simple gesture was receiving. He had never expected that helping one elderly veteran would resonate with so many people around the world. Colonel Hampton arranged for James to speak with a few selected journalists who wanted to understand what had motivated his actions. James was careful to emphasize that he had simply done what felt right in the moment and that he hoped the attention would focus on the veteran rather than on himself. "I noticed that Mr. Thompson was having difficulty seeing the ceremony, and it seemed wrong for a veteran who had served his country with such distinction to miss this historic moment," James explained to one reporter. "The Queen dedicated her life to serving others, and I felt that helping someone experience her funeral properly was a way of honoring her memory." When asked about the decision to step outside of strict protocol, James thoughtfully responded, "Military discipline is crucial, and I take it very seriously. But I also believe that the spirit of our service is about protecting and caring for our fellow citizens, especially those who have served before us. In this case, I felt that showing respect for a veteran was completely consistent with my duties, even if it meant a small deviation from my assigned position." The story continued to gain momentum throughout the day, with television news programs featuring the photograph and the story behind it. James was approached by several media representatives, but Colonel Hampton helped to manage the requests and ensure that he only participated in interviews that would reflect positively on the military and honor the veteran involved. One of the most touching developments came when other veterans who had attended the funeral began reaching out to share their own experiences of the day. Many spoke about how the ceremony had meant to them personally and how seeing James's gesture had reinforced their pride in the younger generation of service members. A veteran named Margaret Sullivan, who had served as a nurse during the Troubles in Northern Ireland, sent a message through the British Legion. "Watching that young guard help his fellow veteran brought tears to my eyes. It showed that the values we've tried to instill in our military, honor, respect, and care for others, are still alive and strong." As the day ended and James finally had a moment to reflect on everything that had happened, he felt a deep sense of satisfaction that went beyond any recognition or media attention he was receiving. He had been able to help ensure that a deserving veteran could properly pay his respects to the Queen, and in doing so, he had apparently inspired others around the world to reflect on the importance of compassion and service. The photograph that had captured his simple gesture was becoming more than just an image from the Queen's funeral. It was becoming a symbol of the values that the Queen had embodied throughout her life, and that continued to inspire people to serve others with kindness and respect. In the weeks following the Queen's funeral, the impact of James's simple act of kindness continued to ripple outward in ways he could never have imagined. The photograph had become one of the most widely shared images from the entire ceremony, not because of its technical quality or historical significance, but because it captured something fundamentally human in the midst of grand pageantry. James returned to his regular duties with the Grenadier Guards, but found that his life had changed in subtle but meaningful ways. Fellow soldiers approached him with expressions of respect and admiration, many sharing their own stories of moments when they had faced similar choices between strict protocol and human compassion. The conversation his actions had sparked within the military community was profound and ongoing. Sergeant Major Williams, a 30-year veteran who served as James's immediate supervisor, pulled him aside one morning during routine duties. "Mitchell," he said with his characteristic gruff but kindly manner, "I've been in this army longer than you've been alive, and I've seen a lot of soldiers come and go. What you did at the funeral, that wasn't just about following or breaking rules. That was about understanding what we're really here for." The sergeant major continued, "Too many people think military service is just about taking orders and following procedures. But the best soldiers, the ones who truly honor the uniform, understand that we serve people, not just protocols. You showed that understanding when it mattered most." These conversations were happening throughout the military hierarchy. Officers were using James's action as a teaching moment in leadership courses, discussing how the best leaders know when to bend rules in service of higher principles. The story was being incorporated into military ethics training as an example of situational awareness and moral courage. Meanwhile, the veteran whom James had helped, Albert Thompson, was experiencing his own wave of attention and recognition. Veterans organizations across the Commonwealth were reaching out to him, wanting to hear his stories and honor his decades of service. The Korean War Veterans Association invited him to speak at their annual dinner, and the Falklands Veterans Association asked him to participate in their next memorial service. Albert's grandson, David Thompson, had started a blog documenting his grandfather's military service and the impact of the funeral experience. The blog post about Albert's time in Korea and the Falklands were gaining readership, with many people expressing fascination with the stories of a generation that had served during some of the most challenging conflicts of the 20th century. "My grandfather never talked much about his service before this," David wrote in one blog post. "He was always humble about his contributions and preferred to focus on the future rather than dwelling on the past. But the kindness shown to him by Lance Corporal Mitchell has somehow opened a door for him to share his experiences with others. It's as if that moment of recognition and respect gave him permission to be proud of what he had accomplished." The photograph and story had also caught the attention of historians and social commentators who were analyzing what the moment revealed about British society and values. Dr. Sarah Richardson, a historian at Cambridge University who specialized in military history, wrote an article for The Times discussing how the image represented continuity between generations of service members. "What we see in this photograph is not just one soldier helping another," Dr. Richardson wrote. "We see the embodiment of values that have been passed down through generations of British military service. The young guardsman understands instinctively that his role is not just ceremonial, but involves genuine care and respect for those who served before him." Educational institutions began using the photograph and story in their curricula. Schools across the United Kingdom incorporated it into lessons about citizenship, service, and moral decision-making. Teachers reported that students were deeply engaged by the story and that it sparked meaningful discussions about how individuals can make a difference through small acts of kindness. One teacher in Manchester, Mrs. Elizabeth Foster, wrote to James through official channels to tell him about the impact his story was having on her students. My class of 12-year-olds has been discussing your actions and what they reveal about character and leadership, she wrote. Several students have told me that your example has inspired them to think about how they can help others in their own lives. One boy, whose grandfather is also a veteran, said he now has a better understanding of why his grandfather's service matters. The story had also reached international audiences in ways that surprised everyone involved. Veterans organizations in Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and South Africa were sharing the image and discussing what it represented about Commonwealth values and military traditions. The photograph appeared in newspapers from Toronto to Sydney, with local veterans adding their own perspectives on the meaning of the gesture. In Canada, the Royal Canadian Legion published an editorial about the incident titled "A Moment That Defines Service." The piece discussed how military traditions across the Commonwealth shared common values of respect, duty, and care for fellow service members. When Lance Corporal Mitchell helped his fellow veteran, the editorial stated, he was acting in accordance with values that transcend national boundaries and unite all who choose to serve. Similar responses came from veterans organizations throughout the former British Empire and beyond. In India, a veterans association published a translation of the story in Hindi and several other regional languages, noting that the values demonstrated transcended cultural and linguistic boundaries. Veterans from conflicts ranging from World War II to recent peacekeeping missions expressed recognition of the universal nature of military camaraderie and respect. The American military community also took notice of the story. The veterans of foreign wars shared the photograph on their social media platforms, and several American military publications featured articles about the incident. American veterans commented that they recognized the same values in their own military traditions and that the gesture reminded them of why international military cooperation and mutual respect were so important. James received dozens of letters from veterans and active service members around the world, many sharing their own stories of moments when small gestures had made significant differences in their lives or in the lives of others. A veteran from the Australian Army wrote, "Your action reminded me of a time when I was struggling during a particularly difficult deployment, and a fellow soldier took a moment to make sure I was okay. It seems like a small thing, but it made all the difference in that moment." A retired U.S. Marine shared a story about how a simple act of kindness from a British soldier during a joint operation had helped him through a difficult time. "Military service can be lonely and challenging," he wrote, "but moments of genuine human connection remind us why we are there and what we're fighting to protect." The ripple effects extended beyond the military community as well. Charitable organizations reported increases in volunteer applications from people who cited James's example as inspiration for their desire to serve others. The Royal British Legion saw a spike in membership applications from younger people who wanted to be involved in supporting veterans. Mental health organizations that work with veterans noted that the story had prompted important conversations about the ongoing needs of elderly veterans and the importance of intergenerational connections within the military community. Some organizations began developing new programs specifically designed to connect younger service members with veterans from earlier conflicts. James's commanding officers began receiving inquiries from other military units and organizations asking if James could visit or speak about his experience. While James remained humble about the attention, Colonel Hampton recognized the value of having him share his perspective with other service members and community groups. Lance Corporal Mitchell has become an unexpected ambassador for the values that define our military, Colonel Hampton noted in a letter to his superiors. His willingness to share his experience and reflect on the choices he made that day is helping to reinforce important lessons about leadership, compassion, and service throughout our organization. The ongoing attention also brought unexpected opportunities for both James and Albert Thompson. Publishers approached them about collaborating on a book about their experience and what it revealed about military service and intergenerational respect. Documentary filmmakers expressed interest in creating a longer piece about the story and its impact. While both men remained somewhat overwhelmed by the level of attention their brief encounter had generated, they also recognized the opportunity to promote positive messages about service, respect, and compassion. James, in particular, was thoughtful about how to use the platform responsibly. "I never intended for this to become such a big story," James reflected in one interview. "But if the attention can help people think more about how we treat our veterans and how small acts of kindness can make a difference, then I think something good is coming out of it." 6 months after the Queen's funeral, James Mitchell found himself standing in an unexpected place: the ballroom of Buckingham Palace, wearing his dress uniform and preparing to meet King Charles III. The events that had unfolded from his simple gesture of kindness had led to this moment, which he was still struggling to believe was really happening. The king had specifically requested to meet both James and Albert Thompson as part of a reception honoring military service and community values. The invitation had come through official channels, with a letter explaining that His Majesty wanted to recognize actions that exemplified the spirit of service that had characterized Queen Elizabeth II's reign. Albert Thompson sat in his wheelchair beside James, wearing his dress uniform with all his campaign medals proudly displayed. The elderly veteran had been thriving in the months since the funeral, energized by the recognition and the opportunities to share his experiences with younger generations. His health had actually improved, as if having a sense of purpose and recognition had given him new vitality. "I never thought I'd be back in this palace," Albert whispered to James as they waited in the ornate reception room. "The last time I was here was in 1982, when I received my Medal for Service in the Falklands. That was from the Queen herself. Now here we are, about to meet her son because of what happened between us at her funeral." The irony and symmetry of the moment was not lost on either of them. What had begun as a split-second decision during a moment of grief and ceremony had evolved into something much larger, a symbol of enduring values and human connection that had touched people around the world. As they waited, James reflected on how his life had changed since that September day. He had been promoted to corporal, a recognition that his commanding officer said was due not only to his exemplary service, but also to the leadership qualities he had demonstrated through his actions and his handling of the subsequent attention. More significantly, James had been selected to participate in a new military initiative focused on veteran outreach and community engagement. His role involved visiting schools, community centers, and veterans organizations to speak about military values and the importance of intergenerational respect and support. The work had proven to be deeply fulfilling for James. He discovered that he had a natural ability to connect with young people and to help them understand the significance of military service and the sacrifices made by previous generations. His presentations often focused on the idea that heroism wasn't always about dramatic battlefield actions, but could be found in small moments of compassion and moral courage. One of his most impactful presentations had been at a school in his hometown in Yorkshire. Speaking to students who came from backgrounds similar to his own, James had emphasized that everyone has opportunities to make a difference, regardless of their circumstances or position in life. "The most important lesson I learned that day," he had told the students, "wasn't about military protocol or following orders. It was about paying attention to the people around you and being willing to act when you see someone who needs help. That's something everyone can do, whether you're in uniform or not." Albert Thompson had also found new purpose in the months following the funeral. Veterans organizations had sought him out not just for ceremonies and commemorations, but for his insights into military service across different eras. His stories about serving in Korea in the 1950s and the Falklands in the 1980s provided valuable historical perspective on how military service and international conflict had evolved over the decades. Albert had also become involved with programs that connected young people with veterans, sharing his experiences and helping others understand the realities of military service. His grandson David had helped him establish a small foundation that provided support for elderly veterans who needed assistance accessing services or connecting with their communities. The foundation had grown beyond anyone's expectations, fueled in part by donations from people around the world who had been moved by the photograph and story from the funeral. The image had continued to circulate on social media, often accompanied by news stories of kindness and service that it had inspired in others. As they prepared to meet the king, both James and Albert were aware that they were representing something larger than themselves. They had become symbols of values that people wanted to believe still existed in the world: respect for service, care for one another, and the willingness to do the right thing even when no one is watching. King Charles III entered the reception room with his characteristic warmth and genuine interest in the people he was meeting. James and Albert stood at attention as he approached, but the king immediately put them at ease with his informal manner and obvious knowledge of their story. "Lance Corporal Mitchell, Mr. Thompson," the king said, addressing them both with clear familiarity with their backgrounds. "I wanted to meet you both personally to express my appreciation for what you represented during my mother's funeral. Your actions that day embodied exactly the kind of values that she spent her life promoting." The king continued, "Military service has always been close to my heart, and I've long believed that the true measure of a soldier is not just in following orders, but in understanding the spirit behind those orders. What you did, Lance Corporal Mitchell, showed that kind of understanding." Turning to Albert, the king added, "And Mr. Thompson, your decades of service to our country deserve recognition and respect. The fact that you were able to properly experience that ceremony, thanks to Lance Corporal Mitchell's thoughtfulness, means a great deal to me personally." The conversation that followed was more extensive than either James or Albert had expected. The king was genuinely interested in their experiences and insights, asking detailed questions about their service and the impact of the events following the funeral. Albert shared stories about his military service, describing the challenges and rewards of serving during different conflicts. He spoke about the changes he had witnessed in military culture and technology over his decades of service, and how the core values of duty and service had remained constant throughout. James discussed his work with veteran outreach and community engagement, describing how the experience at the funeral had shaped his understanding of military service and leadership. He emphasized that the most important lesson had been about the power of small acts of kindness to create meaningful connections between people. The king listened intently, occasionally asking questions that demonstrated his deep understanding of military culture and the challenges faced by both active service members and veterans. His questions revealed genuine concern for the welfare of military families and the importance of maintaining connections between different generations of service members. Near the end of their meeting, the king made an announcement that surprised both James and Albert. He informed them that a new award was being established, the Elizabeth Service Medal, to recognize individuals who demonstrated exceptional compassion and service in the spirit of Queen Elizabeth II example. "You will be among the first recipients of this medal," the king told them, "not just for what happened at the funeral, but for how you have continued to serve others and promote the values of kindness and respect in the months since." The ceremony for presenting the medal was held in the same ballroom where they had met with the king. Family members, fellow service members, and representatives from various veterans organizations attended the event. James's parents and grandfather traveled from Yorkshire, while Albert's family, including his proud grandson David, were all in attendance. As James received his medal, he thought about how the single moment of following his conscience rather than strict protocol had led to this extraordinary recognition. But more importantly, he reflected on how that moment had created opportunities to serve others and promote positive values in ways he had never imagined possible. Albert Thompson, receiving his medal while seated in his wheelchair, represented the dignity and perseverance of his generation of veterans. His presence at the ceremony was a reminder that service to country is a lifelong commitment that doesn't end when the uniform comes off. The photograph that had captured their first interaction continued to circulate around the world, but it was no longer just an image from a royal funeral. It had become a symbol of hope, reminding people that individual actions can make a difference and that the values of respect, kindness, and service remain alive and meaningful in contemporary society. In the months and years that followed, both James and Albert continued their work promoting veteran welfare and community service. Their story became part of military training programs, educational curricula, and leadership development courses around the world. The simple act of helping an elderly veteran see a funeral ceremony had grown into a lasting legacy of service and compassion. It served as a powerful reminder that sometimes the most significant moments in history are not the grand gestures captured by official cameras, but the quiet acts of human kindness that happen when one person simply notices that another person needs help and chooses to act. Years later, when James had advanced in rank and Albert had passed away peacefully at the age of 95, the story continued to inspire new generations of service members and citizens. The photograph remained a testament to the enduring power of compassion and the belief that true honor comes not from following rules blindly, but from understanding when humanity should guide our actions. Their legacy lived on in the countless acts of kindness and service that their example had inspired, proving that a single moment of compassion could indeed change the world, one person at a time.